the problem. We'd made things far more complicated and personal than they needed to be. If we'd been asking the right questions and really listening to each other, we could have avoided the whole mess. That was 2 years ago. A lot has changed. But the debate really hasn't. This is a recent Google search I did just for CSS. So I see the same arguments being made today that we were having 2 years ago. So I want to talk about that today and take a look at both sides of that argument, and then look at the pros and cons of each way that you really can style in React. So I'm going to look at both sides of the debate, starting with the gripes against CSS. We all know CSS is broken, right? CSS uses global scope by default. That is a no-no in JavaScript. Why are we doing it in styles? CSS dependencies and inheritance make style collision and overriding just inevitable. You're looking at separation of concerns all wrong on the CSS side, right? We look at CSS separation of concerns as a separation of technologies. And in CSS and JS, it's really a separation of components and what each piece is doing. And then the cascade, of course, causes thousands of lines of dead code and doesn't work with CSS at scale, so you have this dead code problem. But there are equally strong gripes against CSS and JS. CSS isn't broken, you just don't know how to use it. Using JavaScript to create CSS is excessive and unnecessary. Why are we reinventing the wheel? CSS works just fine on its own. CSS should be separate from your markup. The cascade is your friend if you know how to use it. And of course, oops. Apologies there. The cascade is your friend if you know how to use it. And of course, inline styles are a hack. So both sides, CSS and JS and the CSS side, have some pretty serious concerns about what the other side is doing. So now that we've heard the two sides, let's look at the options. You can break down styling into 4 basic categories, each one with its own sets of pros and cons. I'm going to start with the basics. Standardization methods, otherwise known as naming things intelligently. There are a lot of methods out there. Common thread among all of them is to eliminate style collision by lowering specificity and encouraging modularity. So standardization methods work with CSS, Sass, Less, you name it. And in 2015, BEM was a standardization the CSS camp on the team was rooting for. And BEM stands for Block Element Modifier. Rules are really, really simple. Everything has a class, everything. Elements should never be directly styled, no nesting of styles. And choose clear naming conventions. And of course, you must follow the syntax religiously. So in this example, I have my friend component. Friend is a block. It's a standalone entity that has its own meaning and identity. Any DOM node in my friend block is an element of that block. They are semantically tied to that block and have no meaning on their own. So you would never use friend image or friend name or friend description anywhere else in your code base. It should always live inside that friend block. And a modifier is just an extra class name that can be added to blocks and elements to change its appearance or behavior. Modifiers should only modify the block, never replace it. And in terms of component structure, here's a simple component folder structure to start with. And I'm by no means telling you this is the way to do it. This is just one way that you can do it. I think component folder structure and structure in general is very personalized from project to project. But here we've got this simple structure. Each component should do one thing and do it well. And notice that each folder contains the JS, CSS, and test files. In this example, components have been broken out into 2 categories. So we've got our container components and just our components. The components folder represents our presentational components. They're stateless, and they simply take props. The container components are stateful. They make API calls, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of benefits to this approach. You get better but a different type of separation of concerns. And you get reusability in other projects if that's something you're concerned with. The presentational components also can be worked on by the design team without concern that it's going to affect the app's logic. So there's a lot of pros to BEM and standardization methods in general. I think they're a natural fit for building components. There's no configuration, compiler, etc. So we're using just straight CSS. Nothing to configure, nothing to set up and put together. Using BEM and presentational components, each component can be used over and over again in other projects. And single class names make collisions impossible and easier to rework as long as everyone's following that syntax. Rendering engines evaluate CSS selectors right to left, so the less there is to evaluate, the faster it's going to render. And I think that BEM structure lends itself perfectly to linting, so you can make sure that every style that is added conforms to the same standards. But there are some cons. Let's face it, naming things is really hard. It's probably one of the hardest things that we do. It sounds crazy to anyone that doesn't do this for a living, but I think most of my time building CSS architectures has been figuring out what to name something so someone else knows what I'm talking about. And the rigid structure of BEM is what makes it work, but it's also, I think, what makes it difficult to write at first. It feels really weird. It doesn't feel natural, and when something doesn't feel natural, it takes longer. So it can be really frustrating to do something that you think you could do a lot faster another way, but you're being forced into this syntax and into this particular method. So you got to get team buy-in in order for this system to work. And losing the benefit of the cascade can be seen as a pro or con, depending on which side of the debate you fall on. The cascade can keep things dry when used correctly, or it can result in a bloated code base where styles are repeatedly overridden and hacked. It's possible to use BEM for theming, but I would say that there are far better methods out there if theming is something that's important to you in the work that you're doing. And it may not be a serious con, but something about the underscores and the dashes when you first work them feels really, really ugly. And again, I think it goes back to writing something that's difficult or doesn't come naturally can make things a lot slower. So now I want to talk about inline styles. And inline styles are not the same as CSS and JS, and I'm going to get to that in a minute. And the first two methods that we just talked about have been standard for quite a long time. Adding CSS styles inline goes back even further. But in 2015, the idea of using them to style your entire application seemed kind of crazy. So just like it sounds, inline styles attach your styles inline to the actual DOM node. And again, they're not the same thing as CSS and JS, and I will get to that. But this is a same friend component. It's a simple example of inline styles. And this was the first example that the CSS and JS folks on the team brought to us in 2015. And I got to say, we were horrified when we saw this. And to be fair, this is not how most people are using inline styles. Most are using style objects. It's much more maintainable than the first example. It's also the way React Native handles styling. Most will take it one step further and place the style objects in a separate document and then import that into the component. Sound familiar? Should. So at the time, the thought for many of us was, seriously? You want us to style an entire application like this? The very thought of styling an entire app by injecting styles seemed laughable at the time. Because a big argument, right, had been working with CSS at scale. And from the perspective of the CSS folks, this was not scalable. The font size, color palette of the application had changed several times in just the few months that we were working on the proof of concept. How are we ever going to manage monumental style changes like that with inline styles? Surely there was an obvious need for global styles to handle things like font sizing, vertical rhythm, and color palette. Even more distressing at the time was learning what it couldn't do. And the main difference between inline styles and CSS and JS. So inline styles only supports a subset of CSS. CSS and JS, on the other hand, allows you to use all the power of CSS because it generates actual CSS. And we're going to get to those in a minute. I know I keep saying that, but we're almost there. So while inline styles are lacking quite a bit, I think there are some positives to them. Inline styles really forces you to change your mental model and see each component as its own entity. And this was something that it really did for me. I will admit that I was not against the idea of CSS and JS, but it did go against everything that I had learned, my years and years of best practice, and it really put my hackles up. But sitting down and writing a component and using inline styles really changed my view on that. I was able to see the component as its own concern and see the value in being able to localize those styles. And obviously, inline styles are the trump card in specificity, right? There's no way someone's going to accidentally override them or leave unused styles hanging around. And if you intend to stick with React long term to go React Native, your styles are still going to work. It's going to be much easier to move those over. So the cons list is a bit longer. So you'll need to depend on a library to access basic CSS features. And this was one of the big arguments from the CSS side at the time was we're just adding all these things that CSS does naturally. Why would we do this? And if you're not using a library, it's necessary to program JS workarounds to address media queries, pseudo-selectors, all of the things that CSS gives you just out of the box. And then again, depending on which side of the debate you're on, you lose the cascade. So you're not able to make global style changes using the cascade. Every component would need to be touched if the changes were going to be to go across all the components. And I got to say, it was really difficult to debug in the DOM. I did most of my work in the inspector. And when you're not using mapping class names to the elements, it's really difficult to tell what you're looking at. Even when you know what you're looking at, it's difficult to tell what you're looking at because the styles are jammed in with the rest of your elements. And interestingly enough, the components themselves don't really lend themselves to outside use in other code bases because you're placing these styles directly in line. You'd have to go in and reconfigure basically every single one by hand in order to use it somewhere else. And another interesting thing that we found was that performance was not very good. A page full of inline styles where each tag needs to be parsed is going to be less performant than loading a single style sheet. So CSS and JS is pretty hot right now, but in 2015, it was on fire. And in 2015, there weren't a lot of CSS and JS libraries, aside from Radium, CSS modules, and I think at the time that we were developing, like Aphrodite had just come out. Many of the cons that were plaguing inline JS could also be applied to libraries available at that time. And I think it's evolved quite a bit. Oop. So style components weren't around in 2015, but I think that they represent a giant leap forward in CSS and JS libraries. So I'm going to talk about that today. So here we have our same friend component. Should be very familiar with this component by now. But there's a big difference in the way we're putting this together. So style components actually utilize this tagged template literals to use real CSS and create normal React components. So as you can see, we're importing styled from style components. So we're importing that library, and then we're able to construct a wrapper component that applies the styles to a section tag. So wrapper equals style.section. In the DOM, that's actually going to generate a section tag with a mapped class name that maps to those styles. So it's a big difference in the way that you handle inline styles. It is not inline. It's actually generating a CSS style sheet. So at runtime, it's actually loading that into the head section of your document. and then applying the class name to the styles. So I would say that how you structure your component folder is going to be a team decision, and in most cases should be decided before you ever touch the styles. In this example, I've actually broken that component down even further. Here, the way we've broken it down is we've constructed each piece, and then I'm just building in my render each piece of that component. Here, I've actually broken out each one as its own separate entity, and I'm bringing them into my index file. And that way, I can use these over and over again in other components and other areas and build like a bunch of Lego blocks, really. So this allows more flexibility and scalability long term, as you can easily move those smaller pieces around to construct larger components. So I think style components have a lot going for them, and CSS and JS libraries in general do. They allow you to write real CSS without context shifting between JavaScript and a set of style sheets. And it also enforces CSS best practices by removing that mapping between the HTML and the CSS. Because you're building small, purely presentational components, they're independent and reusable. And single-use class names make, there we go. Single-use class names make naming easier with no chance of collision. And of course, you have your containers and components, so you're separating out your presentational from your logic. Style Components actually has basic Sass support, so you can do things with variables, nesting, mix-ins. There's a lot of really cool features there. It even has native mobile support and theme support. So there are some cons. Choosing CSS and JS as an approach means choosing a framework. So it's one choice followed by another choice. Glamour, Style Components, Aphrodite, CSS modules. There are many flavors of CSS and JS out there. And at the end of this deck, I actually have a resource that takes you to an entire list of all the possible CSS and JS choices you have. And it's yet another library to use, which I think is something to keep in mind because things change so quickly. Relying on a library that's the hot new thing today might be a problem later on. And it's also something that needs to be understood by the entire team. And I think a solid case could be made for the complexity this introduces. Many teams have designers and implementing styles and design patterns in CSS. So while a developer might be able to jump right in and feel very comfortable because this utilizes so much of what's already there in JavaScript, it could be difficult for others on the team. So the question is, what should I use? It depends. I know you're looking for one answer today, but there really is no one answer. I think it really does depend. There are a lot of choices out there. I think you need to start by asking the right questions. So what are the mental models on the team? A mental model is based on belief, not facts. It's a model of what users think or what users know or think they know about a system. And understanding each person's mental model of styling can help clear up misunderstandings and foster productive conversations. I think really having a good idea of how each person sees styling so that you can speak to their view on it a little bit better can help you in those conversations. And I think it's also important to acknowledge the differing skill levels on the team. So if there's a mixture of skill levels, as I said, a lot of times you have designers that are implementing your CSS and may not be as comfortable in JavaScript. Simplicity and clarity can really help everyone stay together. And if you're a group of highly skilled devs, then I think introducing complexity or new technologies probably won't pose that much of a problem. And then what do you need to build? Make sure you understand what you actually need to build. There's a lot of pressure in our industry to know the latest framework, the latest language, or whatever tech is making the rounds today. And it can be really tempting to jump on the latest technology. So before adding libraries and building complex styling systems to accommodate theming and reusability, make sure there's something you actually need. Start out as simply as possible and build from there. And then how do you plan on structuring your project? React is not opinionated about project structure. So understanding how you want to structure your project is going to help you determine the style method that's going to work best for you and the rest of your team. Will container components live separately from presentational components, or are they going to be kept together? Will you have the need for access to global styles? Is that something that you anticipate having to have? And these are just a couple of considerations. So think about these things before you jump into making that styling decision.
Please welcome Max Stoiber.
Hey everybody, my name is Max. I'm back to talk about your absolutely favorite topic, CSS. Yay! Don't we all love CSS? In case you don't know who I am, my name is Max. You can follow me on Twitter with that Twitter handle right there. If you think that looks really, really complicated and you'll never remember it, it's just my name without vowels. All right? So just remember my name, take out the vowels, and you'll have my Twitter handle. I'm the technical co-founder of a newly founded startup called Space Program, which I think is the fucking coolest name ever for any company. The CTO of a company called the Space Program. I mean, come on. And we're building a platform for communities called Spectrum. I am in a bajillion Slack teams, right? Every single month, there's new communities appearing that live on Slack, which isn't actually made for communities, it's made for businesses. And the conversations there are really hard to follow. If you have a big community with thousands of members, it starts breaking down, you don't see your messages anymore, conversations get lost, and it really doesn't work. And people have started looking for alternatives, but all the alternatives aren't made for communities either. So we're building a platform to fix that. And you can check it out right now, and there's a React frequency, which is sort of like a community. So you can go to spectrum.chat/tilde-react. You can see what we've built so far. It's really, we're currently in beta, so don't tell anybody about this, like me, right now. But please try it out and let us know what you think. And Spectrum is built with React, right? And we, and especially the people, you that are here, we're now in what I like to call the component age, right? We've gone from HTML documents and very basic text to rich interactive applications that live on the web. And we've discovered that the original model of the web, documents, doesn't really work perfectly or very well for big interactive user interfaces, right? Built by hundreds of developers at the same time. And so we started thinking about how can we make that better and arrived at this model of small encapsulated components, right? Lego blocks that we build more complex user interfaces out of. As we've done that, we've also discovered some best practices, right? The first one is that we want to have small and focused components, right? They should be encapsulated. They should be like Lego blocks. And the second is that we split containers and components. Now, with small focused components, I mean that they're sort of very easy to understand, right? For example, you have a button component. You don't want people to have to understand what exactly that button component does. They should just be able to use it throughout your entire application and just have a button there, and it works exactly how they'd expect, right? Now, previously with styling, we used to do something like this, right? You'd have a button component and you'd have people assign a class name. So in this case, our class name is button. And then if you wanted a more important button, you maybe had a button -- primary class that you could also assign to make it more bigger and more important, right? So this would be the BEM naming convention. But the thing is, with components, we don't really need those class names, right? These are implementation details. Which specific class names my button component uses, my users of that component shouldn't have to care about that, really. They shouldn't have to know that to use my button component, I also have to use the button class. That doesn't make sense. We already have the component which encapsulates everything, so why do we extract the class name? It doesn't make sense. Rather, with React, it's very common to do something like this, where you just have a button component, and then you have a button component that's set to primary, right? Where the primary property is set to true. The second best practice that I just mentioned is splitting containers and components. And splitting containers and components is extremely nice. This is what it looks like, right? This might be a typical component that you have in your application. You have a sidebar, which fetches some data from some API, and then renders the item that it gets back from the API. But this is sort of conflating two different things. This is managing and fetching data, but also at the same time cares about styling, right? Splitting containers and components, we've sort of started doing something like this in the React community, right? And that switch was very fast, so I'm going to do it again, right? This is the original component. This is what it looks like afterwards, right? It's a very tiny change, but we now have a sidebar container component which cares about the data fetching, and then we have smaller components like a sidebar and a sidebar item that care about specifically what the sidebar does, right? But they don't care about fetching data and passing it in the right format. And that gives us, as developers, a very nice way of working with the application, because if you think about your application as a tree of components, with containers you have these sort of intermediary levels of data management and then other levels about styling and behavior. And it's very nice to work with because I know where to go and to look for a bug, right? If I look in the React DevTools and I see, oh, the properties that my sidebar component received had a totally wrong format, I know I need to go look in the container. If the behavior is wrong, I know I need to go look into the sidebar component. With those best practices in component-based systems, so to sum things up, the short version basically is that containers care about how things work and components care about how things look, right? That's sort of the short version. The thing is that with these best practices in component-based systems, we also discovered some best practices about styling, right? Because CSS was made in an age where the web was made for scientific documents, right? It was made in 1995 when the web mostly consisted of some text, right? And initially the browsers didn't even want to implement something like CSS. They wanted to be the ones dictating what web pages should look like because it was made for scientific papers, right? Why would you have scientists spend days thinking about how exactly their H1 looks when they really just want to write their scientific papers, right? It doesn't make any sense. But in the end, obviously, the web wasn't just used for scientific documents, and they relented and added CSS. Now, in component-based systems, we've also discovered some best practices, right? The first is that we have single-use classes. If you think about it, if you have a button component that's encapsulated and is a button, that might have a class name like our button previously, a button class name. But you wouldn't reuse that button class name anywhere else, right? Because if another developer then comes in and wants to change the styling of the button, obviously they go looking for the button class. If you use that anywhere else, it breaks unrelated parts of your application really surprisingly, right? It's the old bug where in CSS you change some CSS property of some tiny piece of your application down here, and your whole layout just shifts and everything breaks, and you're like, what? What is going on? And that's mostly due to people using class names more than once. And with components, we can just use every class name once and then reuse that component throughout our application, right? If we have a button component, let's just reuse that button component throughout our app and just put the class name in our component. The second best practice is that we use components as a styling construct. And this is a bit unusual, I think, still, but it's, for example, having a grid component and having a column component, having a row component that you reuse throughout your application to get very consistent grids and very consistent layouts, right? Where these components don't necessarily have any specific behavior associated, but they're very much focused on what the styling looks like. But I can look in a component, I can see immediately, okay, this is sort of what it should look like. And does it actually look like it? And it's really, really nice to use. Michael Chan wrote this great article a while back about styling in React. And he had this quote in there, which is, if you're writing React, you have access to a more powerful styling construct than CSS class names. You have components. And I think that's very much the crux of why the whole community has sort of moved towards this encapsulation model, because we have components. We can share them. We can reuse them. We don't need to reuse CSS class names with naming conditions. We can just reuse our components, right? This is a really important point, and it's what everybody's been sort of thinking about and trying to solve. The thing with all of these best practices and all of these ideas is that they're completely useless if they're not enforced, right? We have to get stuff done, obviously, right? Everybody has to get stuff done. That's the whole point of programming. We want to get somewhere. And if we have best practices that stand in our way and that block us and make us slow, we're not going to adhere to them. Obviously, I won't adhere to any best practices that take me ages to figure out, right? I just want to write my application. And that's why we made styled components. It's one of the core ideas of styled components and why it exists. Styled components, for those of you who don't know it, is made by Glenn Madden and myself. Glenn is, you might know as being one of the co-creators of CSS modules. And I went to Australia and we sort of sat down and thought about styling in component-based systems further and came up with what is now styled components. The kind of weird idea in styled components is that it removes the mapping between styles and components, right? Because if you think about it, if you only ever use every class name once, why do you have a class name at all? right? A class name is a mapping between a piece of CSS, some styling, a style fragment, and an HTML DOM node, right? A simple HTML tag. But if you only ever use that mapping once, why do you have a mapping at all? It's totally unnecessary. So this is what styled components looks like. The first time Glenn showed me the very early prototype of what was going to become styled components, I looked at it and I went, you are crazy. This looks absolutely ridiculous. Why would I ever use this? But then I tried it, right? And I did something, just because for the sake of it, because I wanted to try it. I built something like a to-do list in 15 minutes. And after 15 minutes, I looked at Glenn and I went, holy cow. I never want to style any of my applications any different way ever again. So let's take a look at this. The first thing we do here is we import styled from styled components. Very fancy, it's an import. The second thing we do is, and this is where it starts getting weird, const title equals styled.h1, and then a backtick at the end. This styled.h1 thing is a function, right? And this function returns a React component that renders an h1 HTML tag, right? So our title variable here is now a React component that we can use like any other React component in our application, and it'll render an h1 heading. And then we do this backtick thing and pass in some styles into this backtick thing, right? We write some CSS. In this case, our h1 should have a font size of 1.5 em, should be aligned to the center, and should have a color of pale violet red. Now, this weird backtick thing, which I've been saying as that weird backtick thing for a while now, is actually an ES 2015 feature, right? It's JavaScript. It's called a tagged template literal. So if you think about template literals, the strings where you can interpolate things, tagged template literals are the exact same thing, except you call functions with them. So here, we call style.h1 with a string that contains this CSS, right? Now, there's some fine differences between calling functions with parentheses, like you do generally, and calling functions as a tag template literal, but you can look those up in the spec. So we call style.h1 with a string of CSS, and that returns a React component which renders an h1 HTML tag, and that is now our title. Our wrapper is the exact same thing. Our wrapper is a React component that renders an HTML tag section, and it has a color of pale violet red, a width and height of 100%, some padding, and a background of papaya. Right? Now, these are just React components, like any other React components you have in your application. So you can render them like any other React components, right? There's nothing special about those. You can just put them in a JSX. And when you look in the browser, what you see is a section that has a papaya red background and a heading, an h1, that is pale violet red and aligned in the center, right? Surprisingly. Now, something that's a bit weird about styled components as well is that, as you see, you write actual CSS in JavaScript, right? And that was a very deliberate decision we made, because CSS inherently isn't a bad language. CSS is awesome, right? CSS was made to style arbitrary content in arbitrary width devices, supporting thousands of different users at the same time with different constraints, right? CSS as a language works perfectly well. CSS is amazing. There's just parts of it that we don't think work very well in component-based systems, right? It just wasn't made in an era where components were a thing people talked about, right? And so styled components let you write actual CSS because CSS is perfectly fine. And we make it better and enhance it with JavaScript. But that also means that you have full support for anything in CSS that you want. Because it's just JavaScript, of course. Because it's just CSS, you can use media queries, you can use nesting, you can use anything you can think of. So here we have a color changer component, which again renders a HTML section. And this color changer component has a background of papaya red. And any heading within that color changer component has a color of pale violet red. But then we have a media query. And on certain sized screens, the background switches to medium sea green and the color to papaya red. Right? And if we look at this in the browser and resize it a bit, you'll see that the background changes to the width of 875 pixels. Right? Now, there's nothing fancy going on here. This is just CSS, right? It's just a media query. You've all seen this before. You've all used it before. It's just to demonstrate that we let you write actual CSS. Your designers can go in and write the CSS that they're used to. Right? It's just CSS. There's nothing fancy about it. Another thing that we built into styled components is adapting based on properties. Right? If you remember back to the first example I showed you of our button component, that button has a primary property, right? And we want to make it bigger and more important if it's primary, and a bit less important if it isn't primary. So how do we do that with styled components? Well, because we use tag template literals, you can interpolate functions, right? So you can interpolate a function, and that function gets passed the properties of the component. So here we're basically saying if the primary property is set to true, make the background pale violet red, otherwise make the background white. And the color the exact other way around. If the primary property is set, make the color white, otherwise make the color pale violet red. Now you use this like any other React component, right? You just say button or button primary. And if you render these two buttons in your browser, you'll see a normal button and a primary button, right? So this is how you adapt based on properties with styled components. Now, when we tried different libraries, obviously, when I started on this whole exploration of how do I style my React applications, I didn't think I was going to build another CSS and JS library, right? There's 50 out there. Why do we need another one? But the thing is, there's one fundamental thing that many of them were missing that I needed in my applications, which is theming, right? If you encapsulate your components and you don't give anybody access to themes, they now look the way they do, and you can never change them, right? But really, in many cases, I want my application, in different parts of the application, look ever so slightly different, right? I maybe want to tweak some colors. I want to have some global variables that I use throughout my application, and maybe even can update dynamically. So Styled Components has built-in support for theming. We export this theme provider component, and then you define any theme that you can think of. So in this case, we're saying the primary color of our theme is pale violet red, right? And then we just wrap our components, our entire app, in a theme provider and pass that theme to it. And now any styled components can adapt based on this theme, which looks like this, right? Again, we have a function interpolation, and we inject props.theme from the context of this component. So here we say the background of our button should be whatever the primary color is in our theme. Now, if you render this in the browser as is inside of our single theme provider, it'll obviously have a pale violet red background color because that is our primary theme. But you can also have multiple themes inside of your app. So here, we create two themes. We have a red theme and we have a green theme, right? And let's say I want to have the main area of my application be red and the sidebar be green because designers, right? I can just render two theme providers and wrap different parts of my application in different themes. And my components adjust automatically. Look at how we don't pass any prop to this component to change its styling. We don't do anything to the component to change its styling. We just render them in different contexts, right? And if we look at this in a browser, we get a red button and a green button. Now the thing is, this uses React's context feature. So it works as many levels deep as you want, right? It doesn't matter how many divs or components or whatever are in between your theme provider and your styled components, they'll still get the theme.
The basic concept is that you have these chunks of, well, that's not selectable, that's not text. Very well prepared. You have these chunks of CSS, right? So just write CSS, and then we figure out all the other stuff. No, I'll get to this stuff in a minute. Let's just start. I shouldn't be so snarky, but there we go. And you basically import this styled object, right? Which is your way of constructing these styled elements. The way you can tell the JavaScript that you have a chunk of CSS to work with. So import style from style components. And we'll just make sure everything's working. Yeah, okay. And then I can say, replace this outer wrapper, this outer div, with something with a name like outer, right? We say that it's a styled div. Basically saying it's a div tag, but it's a styled one, and we give it some styles. So what do we have here? Text align center, that's a great demo. Okay. Text align center. So now when it renders, obviously it's over there, so we replace this whole thing with outer. And what we've done is we've replaced a div with a class name that is matching up with a CSS file that's over there to now a single unit, right? And this was an idea that really CSS modules kind of lent me towards working with. You work with these names, these single objects, and they have styled and structure together, and this was the best way we could come up with to integrate them, basically. This you may not have seen because I haven't seen many people use it in libraries. Not many people are aware of it. This is an ES6, it's what's called a tagged template literal, which means that it's basically a multi-line string, except me as a library author or anybody who wants to write a function, we can manipulate how that string is interpreted. So we can do some stuff that just isn't possible with normal strings in JavaScript, but it looks like strings in JavaScript. It's quite a forward-thinking addition to the spec. But basically they're just magic strings, and you can do whatever you like, right? So here we have a style div, and then we have another one called app header, which is another div. So we can do const header style div, right? And app header had a bit more. So this is sort of what I'm doing here. So here we have an image, app logo, same process, right? The idea was to keep as much of CSS as we could, right? So this is an image tag, so we say styled image. And we've got an alias for every HTML element, and if you want something that's not in the spec, like a web component, you can just add it as a string, like web component. But generally, you know, the aliases are there. So that should work. So again, this should blow, yeah, that blows up. But we just change this to logo and get rid of the class name. All the other properties, everything just passes through, and this should be kind of like completely invisible. These are just names, right? The same way that you would use class names. You just have to use capital letter, because if you put a lowercase letter, then React will treat it as a HTML tag. That's the extent of its cleverness about HTML tags. Lowercase, tag, uppercase, component. If you use an uppercase letter, so if you use something that you've never seen before, it just passes it through, except if it's got an uppercase character, in which case it'll explode. Because it's like, oh, that doesn't, you know. So, anyway, I've become quite comfortable with uppercase now. But yeah, you can mix and match here. You can even do things like, so in this header, we could say that the H2 is red. And this was big for me because I use this kind of direct descendants all the time in Sass, because you have a component, and like Steve was just talking about, there are cases where you will have more elements in a component than you would prefer. You might have to use a span, you might have to use a label, they might have to be in a particular order that the spec or your particular use case or screen readers demand. But you don't want to think about that when you're styling it. So having to attach a class to every single element or name every individual thing is not a good constraint, and it's something that all the other CSS and JS things you'll butt up against, because you have to reach into these components and change styles, where really that's, you know, anyone who's done Sass should be pretty comfortable with that. Same. Yeah, basically this whole thing compiles down to big old class name. That, basically, that chunk of CSS. It's almost, with Sass. You know, if you were thinking Sass or PostCSS nested, is like the first version of this was generate a random class name and stick it and an open bracket on the front and a closed bracket on the back, and then throw it to PostCSS. It is a really nice way to think about it, because the one thing that you don't actually care about is the class name. If you've started to use CSS modules or something, that the only thing it exists there is to be a name for your, you know, as your developers to use to communicate. The computer doesn't actually care about it at all. So let me just finish off. So we have an intro thing here. So const intro, that was a P. Font size large, right? Really nice and easy. Should just work. And so the reason why, the reason I like this design, the reason we pushed in this direction, is anything that clutters, like if you haven't done a lot of React, then you might think of having a JavaScript file with markup in it is a bit strange. It's like a weird kind of convolution. I certainly did before I started using it. But after a while, it feels like a pretty good unit of work. It is a component that has some structure and it has some methods. So you have some other things like element clicked would be a function, and that does some things. And that kind of does, make sense to be fairly close to the markup itself, right? If you can keep these units nice and small and single purpose, then it does work. It does reduce the amount of things you have to think about when you're working on this stuff. But every time I saw something that has tries to put styles in even CSS modules is something like this. You have these two tokens. You have like a div and the class name. But what's worse is as you start to get, particularly inline styles, you might do something like this. Oh, no, you need two because, yeah. And then you have to camel case because you're not using CSS anymore. Oh no, but you have to quote this, and you can't use semicolons, of course. And then you have, something else. So like font weight 400. This thing, to me, breaks the fluidity of working with CSS when you have to jump out. The other thing that's annoying is that it breaks... Wait a sec. Sorry, I'm just going to quit Flux. So I hate this stuff that breaks your flow, because the idea is that this is the structure. This is how you used to write HTML. In fact, when you have like a big heavy form or something with lots of attributes, it becomes very hard to see the structure. Whereas I think JSX and HTML are really good at showing you structure, particularly in the absence of lots of noise. So this is why I like this approach. Same attributes that you use normally, all the styling information is flat, just like CSS. It just happens to be wrapped up in JavaScript. So I'll just show you some of the other things that you can do, because the idea is to be able to never use CSS. So we can get rid of the file. We have some global CSS here. And get rid of that as well. Oh, I have an animation as well. So we just have a nice little helper, so you don't have to Is that what it's called? Inject little? I think it is. Should work the same thing. Just make sure that that is working. Yep. So, and so you don't generally have too much global CSS, but it's nice to not have to grab another library or break, the one mental model. And the other thing is keyframes, because they are global, but they're kind of global in a weird way. They're just global because here you need a name that you can reference. And so for us, we just, we've got JavaScript, so let's just make a way of doing animations with this little as possible. Right, and if I should go backwards. Yeah, right. So it's just CSS. It's just a few different preambles around it, right? But the result is a single file, right? The benefit of bringing in HTML or bringing in markup into JavaScript is about your delineation of thought, of being able to consider this whole thing as a complete unit and not have internal structure that you always have to worry about. When it comes to CSS, it's the global scope. You have classes that are always out in the global scope, and CSS modules was designed to target that one problem. It's like, now you don't have a global scope, so you don't have to worry about the internals of these things. This just goes the next step. What you can then do with this next step is why I'm using it now on all my projects, because it's not just a superficial replacement. Now you have JavaScript whenever you have a problem. So let's do that same thing with a logo. Let's just make one of them go backwards. So we can just arbitrarily define extra attributes to these things because, you know, this is all our stuff. And I can go is it reverse? Right. And so what I've done there is that this is a magic string, right? So normally, if you tried to put a function inside a string, it would just come out as, it would two-string the function and it would just be garbage. It wouldn't be CSS at all. But we can do magic with it, basically. We can hold this thing and defer it so that when the component gets rendered, we can look at what properties it has where we can execute the function. And anything this function returns, we can inject into the source. It's complicated underneath to get it all working, but the output is great because now we can arbitrarily add these things to basically say header dark, and then go up to here and we have a variant here which actually here we say props dark. That one's dark. Or we can do things like default values like that. And because it's just strings, we basically just have JavaScript in order whenever we have a coding problem. So in that sense, it's much more like a replacement for something like Sass, which is a language of constructs built on top of CSS in a dialect that's valid CSS or valid enough CSS. This is just trying to take all the CSS parts and then put it in touching distance of JavaScript. So yeah, and that's, now we have changeable public APIs that change the styles that are rendered, and it's all done dynamically and it's all nice. But hopefully, to me, this was as good as we could get it, right? Without needing a build step or a Babel transform or something crazy. This reads as good as I could possibly come up with after a few months of work. Yeah.
With your descendants like this, can you reference another style component?
Yeah. We got an open issue about it. It's a real pain. So and it's all because of the way React works. You need to be able to render. So the way that we get these class names. So you see that this. I'll get out of it. These two elements have totally different class names. They don't share anything. Let's just make this full screen. Jam this to the side. Actually, no. So here we have. We run auto prefixer, like a very small auto prefixer that doesn't add a lot of weight, just gets run inline. So these two things, this one has an extra line of CSS, this one doesn't, but they're just generated. Class names, and we don't use any multi-class stuff. And the reason is the way these classes are generated is we take whatever the CSS is as it's generated and then hash it so that it's unique, right? Problem with asking something to overwrite another style component as a descendant or something is that you need to know what that class, or you need to be able to target it somehow. And
could you interpolate H2 with the reference?
Of which?
If you did the double sign racing, but reference the other component?
No, because it would render out the words object.
If you run it with the magic thing and then defer it to later, would that?
The idea is you still have to generate CSS and you still throw CSS in the head, so that CSS has to match that element. We're not doing anything crazy in the React world to actually reach across these boundaries. We're basically just generating CSS and attaching it to elements. We're trying to make as much CSS as possible, but when you don't have a guaranteed reference for an element, the idea is that if we can make it so much easier to just add a property to that element and to be able to just pass through like a public API and change something internally. The other thing, do you have a question?
If you're making I'm arguing for Glenn. If you're making better here, it's probably its own component somewhere else, and H2 is internal detail you don't need to know about, nor do you need to care what class it has on it.
Yeah.
So, yeah, sometimes you want things to, for example, if you have input inside, let's say, every cell or some description,
Yeah.
it may naturally look a little bit different. And rather than having the implementer have to worry about those details, ideally you have a standard UI kit that understands and reacts accordingly.
Well,
I want to argue the other things. I would put the same bug in CSS modules about doing the referencing.
yeah. No, actually, it was one thing. The reason we wanted to do it is because it came up in CSS modules tracker a few times. So we have a different approach, and I'll demonstrate it. So let's say that your header, right, your component, your header thing, is in some cases. Let's get rid of the dark stuff. I don't like dark stuff. I like Papaya Web. Let's say that what you might have had was props dot. Sorry, gonna need this, aren't I? Oh, and that's not valid CSS. Sorry, context switching. Let's say there would be something like a version of this which is underlined, right? Or uppercase. Uppercase is better, right? So you could have a function called uppercase. Right. Let me just make sure I got my syntax working. Right, you could do that. You could add it to this public API, or you can do something else, which is called theming, or yeah, theming, I guess. There's not terrible. Well, it's not a bad example, but you could do this as other ways with CSS. So it's just a purely a pure example for the sake of argument, where you could say that if there is some theme variable, some context, which says that they're uppercase, so let's just say alternate theme, right? If we're in some environment. So normally this will work without, it won't render this thing. But what we can do is we have a React specific thing called theme provider, and we can wrap this thing. This is where you have to use object syntax because there's no better way. What do I call it? I call it alternate theme. And now what we've done, and this to me, so CSS custom properties, the CSS variable spec is going to let you build these components that can adapt. You know, you set properties somewhere, and this thing just works, right? So it reads your column gutter, it reads your font hierarchy out of these CSS custom properties and just renders itself, and it will always work. And to me, it's going to make a big difference to how people share code. But given that the support for CSS variables it's pretty good now for modern browsers. Still, if you're not going to be just supporting brand new browsers for the next few years, then you won't be able to use it because there's no good polyfill. I will look for other ways to implement the same idea. So how about we change this idea here and we go, rather than having alternate, let's just say this is foreground, right? And now we say foreground is pale violet red. No, let's do tomato. I like tomato. And background is papaya whip. Always papaya whip. Ah, damn it. No, it's just a color property. Now, if we took the same thing and we had it outside, well, we're going to need some backgrounds. Obviously, we're going to need some fallbacks. Actually, let's reverse that. So now we have the exact same markup here. In fact, we can even render this into its own component, right? We have this unit that doesn't care about this stuff. So right, and I'll just do it for okay. Let's see how fast I can do this. Oh, not very fast. Oh, I've done this a lot recently. Oh, that's the wrong one. All right, now we jump across to here and we go, you, don't need you anymore. What else do we have? We need the, oh, this is taking longer than I thought. Logo. What else? Logo. No, animation. Oh, what a demo. So smooth. Tell me. Ah, keyframes! See how, look how easy it is to work with styles in JavaScript? So the point here is that this component is completely ignorant of its surroundings, except that if you send it a background and foreground, it'll figure it out. And if you don't, it has its own styles. And that, to me, is such a powerful concept because it means that every time you have this library of reusable components, they can just adapt. Whatever the theme is, whatever their environment is, they'll just render themselves correctly. So we're currently in this big kind of long process of speccing out exactly how far this could be taken because you could arguably change a lot of the internals of each component based on the theme. And that completely supplants the need to be able to reach into components and override stuff if you have control of the authoring of that component in the first place.
I guess if you don't, then you can't do much about that.
Well, you can reach into its tags, you can reach into its structure, you can select on any element that it gives you, but you just can't, I mean, the idea is if you're trying to reach into a styled component, the idea is styled components has also given component authors a way to make things customizable.
So why do you use this as context over prompts?
Because now this header element has no properties. It has no public API. It has an implicit styling API.
Is the thing by using context?
Yes. Yeah, it has to do a bit of a dance. But if we put the theme provider further out, then they'll both look like that. But put them here. So there's nothing about direct children or stuff. You could have tons of elements in here. Oh, that didn't work at all. Oh, that's broken. Yeah, it doesn't, there's no direct kind of children stuff here. And this to me is like trying to really take what React can do and expose it in a way that I would like to work with it, rather than a way that seems like the easiest possible way to interact with it.
This solves that.
Yeah. Yeah. Whereas CSS modules, because it doesn't have a mechanism, because it doesn't hook into the render cycle. Yeah.
But before you show the implementation of output for caching and evaluating the faults, I was going to ask, is there a plan to make a Webpack or able to plug in to do this ahead of time instead of shipping a CSS pass to the browser?
Yeah, we've got a bit of, we're in the middle basically of a big discussion about that because I may as well explain the big problem is that, let's say here, so we have this backwards thing. If you do animation direction forwards, then initial maybe, right. Then it's the fact that this, which is a dynamic section, appears before a line that overrides it. That means that it doesn't apply, and if you reorder those things. And any kind of approach to try to extract static and dynamic parts and separate them is going to need some careful consideration about how to resolve those things when things run, So even at the moment, if you say, like hover over something and change the properties and re-render stuff, then we will keep generating different class names, right? And in fact, I've got kind of like a test here where this is generating a new class for every different color, just as like a stress test. They all go next to each other so that you don't, if you have something that has a direct descendant or something, it doesn't suddenly appear in a different part of the CSS. That's the sort of stuff that is really tricky to keep consistent. And so while we would like to be able to ship a static CSS file, it's not, and we actually have some work, there is a Babel transform there already to extract the CSS stuff. It's really not trivial. And in fact, it might be better to, yeah, we don't know yet. Yeah.
Is there a way to do sort of composition stuff, like so it's not just big chunks of reusable styles?
Yeah, I mean, it's just strings. So we can take these three things and go, all right, this is now my styles.header-ish stuff, right? And then I can do import styles from styles. Yeah, it's all deferred. What did I call it now? Why did I use such a silly name? The only thing that you have to be aware of is that if you want to do anything clever, crafty, delayed in here, you have to use an internal thing. Oh god, oh I can't type at all. And you just do that. The reason being that these aren't real strings, these are magic strings, and so anything can be just represented as a string, you can just use a string, but if you want to use anything clever, you have to show that up. And I think that'll work. Yeah, it does. So things like flexbox properties, you have an alias for being like centered flexbox, centered horizontal flexbox, or you typographical stuff. So instead of using a composition which adds an extra class, you just add another chunk of CSS. Yeah. So auto prefix, if you compile it for the browser, is 1 megabyte. Because it has the can I use database for every, like the usage information back to IE6, which isn't all that useful. We actually use one of the other styles in CSS and JavaScript, kind of light auto prefixer, because you don't really need that much anymore. Like this kind of approach, you're probably going to be shipping products to IE10 plus. And so there's a lot of prefixes you can just do away with. There's nothing in this that won't work on IE9, I don't think. But nobody's asked us to try it because we have a few, there's a bunch of people using it now, but only a bunch. So, but theoretically, there's no problem. Yeah, so, well, the thing is that there are good JavaScript color manipulation libraries, right? And every time that you're trying to do, like, you think about your dev tools, you think about throwing exceptions, you think about all the feedback mechanisms working with JavaScript will give you, debugging, doing everything like those kind of manipulations in JavaScript is more consistent because really, when you're talking about using a polyfill for a future spec, you kind of just, you are kind of breaking with what you know works. You're just like learning this new syntax and trying it out and making sure it works. And to me, that's actually better to use a JavaScript library to do that because, yeah, the feedback is better. But to stick with CSS for everything.